owe him a thank you for remembering to do that. I owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude for bringing me here and for all that we do here. This office would not be here without Bob. Much of the work we do here, including in Matt's group and other groups, is directly derived from proposals that he wrote and things that he helped us teach how to do. So I really appreciate how much Bob has done for us, and I'm glad that he's able to come talk to us today. Some of the early people that he hired here include Matt and David, and Forrest was here before Bob, so I can't give Bob credit for that, but maybe Craig goes to Forrest for Bob. Brian Schott is online here. Anyway, he's had a huge influence on ISI, and especially here in Arlington, which we really appreciate. And Bob, you're about to speak too much with this, but we want to present you a token of our appreciation for our distinguished alumni speaker.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You may be the first one to get one of these, I'm not sure. Second, number two, but anyway, you're at the top.
Okay, thanks very much.
So I guess I will leave it there and let you get started.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thanks everyone for inviting me here today. I'm Bob Parker, and I used to work here a while ago. It's been 10 years since I've been in this building, but more remarkably, for some reason, ISI is celebrating its 50th anniversary. I have no idea how that happened, but I was curious and I kind of poked around a little bit and discovered that there were some articles written about the accomplishments that ISI has done over the last 50 years. But curiously, they were all talking mostly about the visible part of the accomplishments, and it's remarkable. There have been a lot of them, but there were no articles about technology under the hood, and that is the hardware technology that enables a lot of this work to be done. And you're familiar with the term under the hood? I just want to make sure I'm calibrated here. Okay. So in order to do that, I want to make an assertion. I assert that a lot of the early hardware advances that ISI did have influenced technology that has touched almost every human on the planet. And during this talk, I want to give you a couple examples of how that's happened. But first, I want to give you a counterexample. So since I have a captive audience and I've been doing a fair amount of traveling since I retired from ISI, I'd like to share with you one of my all-time favorite places in the entire planet. And buttons don't work. There we go. This will work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably got it focused.
This is Western Mongolia. And the only people out here, the only humans out here are at least one, maybe two tribes of nomads that still migrate by camel caravan. And that's the only sign of life. Other than that, the only way you can tell that any human was ever here was that occasionally there are rock piles or grave sites spread around the countryside, not very many. And allegedly in those mountains in the background, there are some snow leopards, allegedly. And that's the reason we were there. And of course, there are no roads, we just drove four-wheel drive vehicles. And there's no sounds, no human sounds at all, and no airplanes in the sky, no airplane trails or anything. So it's absolutely a remote place. And I can tell you with certainty that ISI technology has had no impact whatsoever on this spot on the globe. And that's a very good thing. So let's go back to history. In order to explore ISI's history, we have to go back in time. In fact, we have to go back to the beginning of time. Well, to the beginning of ISI time. So around spring of 1972, roughly March to be specific. In order to do that, we're going to have to use the Wayback Machine. Now, there's quite a few of us, but I think we can all fit in the Wayback Machine. And it'll be a little bit of a tight squeeze. You may feel a little nausea on the trip, but it will pass, and technology is fairly reliable. And so we're gonna make that travel. But wait a minute, I sense that I may be losing some of you again. You are familiar with the Wayback Machine? Anybody
The plan is
not familiar with it, you know? And, well, all right, so some of you may not know. So in order to get you back on track and into this talk, if you really want to do it on your own, I know your education's somewhat limited and don't have the experiences that I have. And so you may not know what the Wayback Machine is. So you need to Google Mr. Peabody. He was an eminent historian and time traveler. And so we're going to use his technology to explore ISI.
You know,
So now
there's
that we're
another
all-
Wayback Machine?
Sorry?
There's another Wayback Machine?
Yes, and it's
on the
not that one. If you Google the Wayback Machine, you're going to get the wrong answer. It's somebody's bright idea.
Flux capacitor.
But you can use that Wayback Machine to find old ISI web pages, which I did just yesterday.
Ah, okay, so it works. So you get there eventually. Here we are. We're back. We made it. We're back in March of '72. So what's going on? Actually, what we have to do in order to understand the hardware story is we have to go back a couple of years earlier, at least from my point of view. This was my first day at ISI. It was March '72. In 1970, in the spring, I was just graduated from college, and I went to an organization called RAND in Santa Monica. And I joined a group led by Keith Unkefer. It was a computer science research group. They had both a hardware team and a software team. And unbeknownst to me, they had a very good reputation in computer research. That's where the RAND tablet was made. It was one of the first human computer interface pointing devices. The JOS computer came from RAND, and I actually got to program that when I arrived. That was kind of fun. And Computer Data Corporation, CDC, spun off from RAND. So they had a fairly long and well-established history of computer science research. That goes back even before my time. And so as a young design engineer, I was a double E. I got to design a new challenge every day. It was a wonderful place to work. For some reason, technology came into RAND for evaluation. And so I got to see all sorts of prototype equipment from all over the country. It was a really interesting optical drive from IBM that I remember. And there was an interesting paging drum that was kind of a hybrid between a disc and a drum that had been invented. And we actually took that with us to ISI. We also had a machine called the MLP 900, which was a hardware emulation engine. And I don't have time to talk about that one either today, but that's a very interesting piece of hardware. And it was our first major computer project at ISI that we took that machine with us. And so we're now have moved forward, and we're back into 1972. We were given the option to stay at RAND or leave, and about half of us left to join this startup to do something that we didn't know what it was. So we walked out the door, and I have to tell you a story now. So what happened was, this was probably somewhere around March of '72. They'd selected the site in Marina del Rey. It was the south tower of the Twin Towers. And I got a call that said, hey, we're going to have a kickoff for ISI. Cocktail party. Well, I got to toast the beginning. And so I drive to ISI, drive to the building, park in the outside lot, go up to the 12th floor, doors open. I walk out, go to the left, and there's nothing there. And when I mean there's nothing there, I mean there are no inside walls there, and there are no outside walls there. And so what you saw was the slabs, the floors, and vertical columns holding it together. So I cautiously walk out and around the corner, and sure enough, here's a table set up, and we toasted the beginning of ISI. Absolutely a surreal experience. I'm not going to talk much about some of these factors that had to come together to create ISI, but I may mention it again at the end. It's absolutely remarkable that ISI actually occurred, because a whole bunch of factors had to come together at one time. But I do want to mention one thing at the bottom here. The first contract that we got was an umbrella contract. So one contract covered all of ISI for 3 years, and which of course never happens today. But if you take a look at that, the list of research topics at the bottom of that slide, you may notice something really unusual about that. So ARPA had decided they want to build an ARPANET. Right, a network, a distributed or across the country network. So how do they do it? Well, they go out and they find universities and they fund research in addition to funding the actual building of the network itself. So if you were a bureaucrat in Washington in 1970, would you take the risk of going out and funding a bunch of flaky university researchers to build technology that you might someday be able to use to build a military network? You know, I think that is pretty remarkable. And so what actually happened because of that, DARPA deciding to do it that way, they sustained funding for 2 decades, which of course is also unprecedented. And they pulled together all of the major researchers in the country. They graduated probably 1,000 PhDs in computer science that were all building technology that would eventually support the ARPANET. I mean, that's an astounding feat. I just can't imagine somebody at DARPA, a decision maker, being able to make that commitment and sticking to it.
Okay.
So most of the work that I did was in network research, the second one.
Quick question, when you said people were given the option to stay at RAND or move to USC, if it was staying at RAND, it was with constraints on the budget for the computing, or there was something?
You know, I don't know. I didn't, so I walked out the door, obviously. And I don't know what happened to the group because the leadership left. Keith, you know, and his primary team left, half of the rest of the people left. My boss on the hardware side stayed, but he was close to retirement. So I think he was protecting his investment, right? So I don't have any idea what happened to RAND after that in this particular area.
It's still around today.
So this is the earliest picture I could find of the ISI Computing Center, 1975. The physical plant looked exactly the same in 1972. It was built out this way, but the only difference is in this picture, there are a lot more machines. So I want to give you a little tour. And what's the best way to give them a tour? Can I do it with the mouse?
Mouse is not
Or can I do it? Actually, I can do it with this.
Yep.
Will you see that? Okay. So I'm going to talk. So I want to orient you. So let's, for the moment, assume that Lincoln Boulevard runs north and south, which it doesn't, but it just makes it easier for reference here. So the computing room, this computing room was on the 12th floor of ISI, top floor, had the primary view. On the left side, it would be the Lincoln Boulevard side. So this is a window wall over here. Oops.
Oops, don't click.
Window wall right along here. So you're at the north end, you're looking south. There are machines. You can see the little console sticking out into the room. And it's hard to actually point to them. There's one there, one there, one there, and one here. These three are identical there. So the machine of choice at that time, scientific computing, was made by Digital Equipment Corporation, and they were called PDP-10s. There were 3 generations of them, KA, KI, KL. And we had all 3 generations of those machines. But at the beginning, the difference, if you viewed this computing center here from the north looking south, we would have only had the KA-10 at the beginning. So there are 3 that look similar. Those are the 3 KAs. This one here is KI, the one that's this gentleman is kneeling in front of, praying to the dead gods, I guess. And this big one here in the middle is the newest one, the KL-20. In the back, that's the MLP 900 that the micro programmable engine. All of the speech processing equipment is back in this back corner, 2 PDP-11s and some signal processing. That's where most of my work was done in building hardware, was back in here. There's a Xerox graphics printer, which is the first high resolution printing device on the network. Again, another piece of hardware. Now, by the way, if for some unimaginable reason you're interested in learning a little more about this after this talk is over, I did do a paper on this. It's on the website. So here we are in the computer room looking south, and the air handlers and stuff are on the wall to the right. There's one back in here, one on the back wall. That door right there is the door to a machine shop. So you're on the east side of the 12th floor. You're looking at about 2/3 of the floor. Beyond that door is a machine shop. And that machine shop is fully outfitted. It's got milling machine, lathe, table saw, welding equipment, grinders, metal brakes, everything that you would need to build anything you wanted to build. And the reason that we had that is that we had to invent all the hardware that built the ARPANET. It didn't exist. So we actually built hardware that looked extremely professional. We had those designers in that model shop, George Dietrich, Shorty Garza, were very talented, and they built all the enclosures for all the special purpose hardware that we did at ISI. And that MLP 900 that I mentioned, that had to be completely rebuilt. So all the enclosure and the fans and the mounting and the bus bars and all that stuff they did in the machine shops. That's why we had a machine shop. But it was a machine shop with the best view in LA. So also another story, around Christmas time, when it was last afternoon before we all took off, you could wander around ISI and you know, meet your colleagues and wish them well for Christmas and all that. And you could visit this machine shop for drill press punch. That was one of the highlights of the Christmas season, was visiting that location for drill press punch. If any of you remember that. So you have to understand the model of computing back then. So we're back in 1973 here, and the word laptop is in quotes because this isn't a laptop; it's a terminal. And the thing was that, you know, we built out a huge computing center, right? The thing at ISI that I just showed you. That was a model of computing. People had dumb terminals, and they remotely accessed their computing resource, which was centralized in some location they connected to over the ARPANET. And that's the way computing was done. Even the workstations were dumb at that time, the VT100s and that kind of stuff. They had no smarts in them, and they were not. So you didn't do any work on your local machine. Your local machine allowed you to connect to something. So at this time, if you Google Texas Instruments 733 or 725, you'll find this thermal printing suitcase. It's about that wide, that tall, handle on it probably weighs 60 pounds. And if you wanted to connect to the ARPANET remotely, if you were on travel any place other than sitting at a node of the ARPANET, that was your choice. You could carry one of those things around and drop it down on the table and plug a phone into it, and that's the way you could connect to the ARPANET. The only way, no wireless, forget that. That didn't happen. Well, it didn't even exist. So that was sort of the standard. And that's how you connected to the ARPANET if you worked close to a node. So we built this terminal. This old guy weighs about 10 pounds. It's got keyboard, display, and in this case, an acoustic coupler. It's a full-size keyboard. The display, however, is fairly limited, 8 rows of 32 characters. That was kind of the status, as much as you could get at the time. But this was good enough to connect. So actually, the baud rate, it says 1200 baud. That was pushing it in those days. That's 120 characters per second. So you could imagine typing. It reasonably supported good typists. So you're able to sit there and type at about that speed, and you could actually interact with the terminal. That would allow you to interact with your email, whatever, while you're on travel. So that really wasn't a limitation. The biggest limitation of this was the display, the 32 characters, because you know even the dumb terminals, the VT100s and that sort of stuff, they were 80 characters across the screen. So if you were fortunate enough to have your email stacked up in the first 32 columns or so, then it would scroll down nicely. But if it didn't, then you're kind of going back and forth, along the line as you're trying to read your email.
No, the programs were column dependent.
And there were column dependencies that were forget it. That was going to be a real problem. So this thing, as I said, weighed about 10 pounds. When DARPA often visited ISI, and almost the first time that we showed this terminal to the office director at DARPA, it disappeared and we never saw it again. So he took it on travel and he just used it for the rest of the time. That's Richard Bisbee modeling it there. He was a research scientist at ISI, has also passed away. So what happened? So the basic concept of this terminal, the full-size keyboard, a display, and a way to communicate in a folded up enclosure, well, those ideas have carried forward to today. That's what laptops are. The component technologies, of course, have proceeded light years ahead in order to make laptops what they are today. That transition to a laptop really occurred with the microprocessor when it got invented, because that allowed intelligence to be put inside the terminal. That's the big thing. So a lot of the work that ISI did in the early days involved networking. One of the big challenges was digital voice. How do we communicate over the ARPANET? And as you can see, there were 4 or 5 years there from 72 to 76 where we continuously improved the ability to communicate over the ARPANET, person to person and then group to group. And a lot of that involved protocol development on the software side, but there were a whole bunch of hardware control boxes and that sort of stuff that I did on the hardware side that enabled those things to happen. And that, you might look at that and say, well, in 1974, we had this 8 kilobit CVSD. Well, that's continuously variable slope delta modulation. It was a pretty good way to encode speech. And 8 kilobits seems like nothing, right? So why wasn't that the end of the line? Why weren't we done? Well, the original phone lines that connected the ARPANET were 64 kilobit phone lines. And so the main backbone of the internet, of the ARPANET, was 64 kilobit phones. And if you think about the overhead and all that, and you try to pump a few of these 8 kilobit per second voice signals over that network, forget it. So even those were too much bandwidth for the existing ARPANET. Linear predictive coding came along. Other people, SCRL up in Santa Barbara, did a lot of that research, and we brought that into our own systems and used it. Created the protocols, as I mentioned. And so we were making pretty good progress and with the ability to do conferencing on the network via speech. That was around 76. And then some of you may know Danny Cohen. Danny was a really bright scientist, but he was also a little bit of a crazy professor type. And there was a young software engineer, Steve Kasner, and myself, the hardware engineer. And Danny would call us into his office occasionally and rant on about something that didn't exist, that he thought was really important to have. And we'd have to go off. It was sort of like the North Pole, right? It was sort of like Santa and his elves, right? Steve and I were the elves, and we'd go in and we'd visit Santa, and Santa'd say, well, I got to have this new toy. And so we'd say, oh, okay. We'd walk out, we'd figure out how to do it. Well, so I remember this day. Steve and I were called into his office. We had no idea what was going to happen. He had commissioned the machine shop to build him an ergonomic workstation. So I don't remember much about the design of it, except that as you were sitting there, instead of having the screen sitting here in front of you, it was kind of down here at 45 degrees in a hole. Anyway, so we had, that had been built for him. We had just recently put faxes on the ARPANET. Back then, fax machine, the Rapicom R450 was as big as a clothes washing machine. It was a fax machine. And it had to talk to another fax machine synchronously, right? That's the only way you could send faxes between two machines. And so we had gone in and intercepted that stream coming out of the fax machine. I built the hardware for it. We captured that stream and then put it in a file. Well, now it's digital data, right? You can manage it any way you want to. You can store it, you can send it, you can do whatever you want to do to it. And tomorrow you can send it to a fax machine if you want to. So anyway, so Danny had the ability to do his email, right? He could do his research papers or whatever. He could send faxes and manage them. He could do that all from his workstation. Cool. Well, so when we got in there, he starts off ranting about this stuff. He says, and my phone is over here. Computer here, phone there. Why is my phone over there? Why doesn't my phone function inside my computer? Okay, so we scratched our heads on that one because we had no idea what the heck we were going to do. So I'll quickly go through some of the things that came up while we were thinking about how we were going to do this. The obvious thing about it is that the Bell system for, 40 or 50 years before that time had been circuit switched, right? You know what that means, right? It's if you and I want to talk, I dial a number and I'd call your phone. And when you pick up that phone, the Bell system has made a physical connection through wires and relays between the two of us. So we've captured a circuit for the duration of the time that we're actually talking, circuit switched. Well, the world of ARPANET was packet switch, right? Nobody knew what that meant. Packets flying all over the place, latencies changing, nobody knew, no way to bound it, all kinds of problems. Bell system was analog. It had all the features of analog, right? It had, you could get signal artifacts, echoes, and you probably don't remember any of this, right? You're too young. But anyway, it was sort of flaky in that sense. I mean, you usually always got a dial tone, which is good news. But when you made the call quality might vary considerably depending on how far the person was away from you and all sorts of other hardware, problems. So the Bell system also was half duplex. What that means is that when you and I were talking, I had to be very polite and wait for you to finish talking. Then I could talk and you'd have to listen. That's the way it worked. Half duplex, you could not send stuff both ways. Well, the ARPANET didn't care. The packets were flying all over the place. They didn't care where they went. It could be, it could be 10 people talking at the same time. So what ISI, so I'll jump ahead a little bit. So what ISI actually enabled by making this connection between these two worlds is they enabled you to be rude on a phone call. So now suddenly you can make rude phone calls. You don't have to wait, your girlfriend's talking about, fixing up her hair or something. You don't have to wait till she finishes. You can just jump right in and cut that off immediately, and then you'll hear each other. So that's a benefit of ISI technology. Anyway, ARPANET clearly had the long haul advantage, but this was probably the most important one. At the very beginning, there weren't very many nodes of the ARPANET. So if you really wanted to communicate on the ARPANET, you would have to go close to an ARPA node to do it. So the Bell system owned the last mile, which is the connection to everybody's home in the country. And that for a while would be the model that we'd have to figure out how to overcome when we wanted to connect people together. There was, of course, the toll charge thing, the calls. Data over the ARPANET was free, but ARPANET wasn't really a business model. And so there would have to be some sort of business developed that would sit on top of the ARPANET and provide phone services in the digital world. And of course that did happen. But that would cut off the Bell system, right? They would no longer be able to charge you per mile for your phone stuff because you wouldn't be running at their wires anymore. So there was some interesting, interesting disruptive technology that was going to happen. So what did we do? So I built this little board, and it connects two worlds together. Let's see. This area over here, these two wires, that's the Bell system phone wires. There are only two wires coming to your house and your phone. That's half duplex analog. That's all you need, two wires. Down at the bottom of that same picture is all the digital interface stuff that went out to the vocoders and whatnot, the packetizers for the ARPANET. So this piece of hardware was what connected those two worlds together. And it was a very important piece of hardware. It was actually prior art in at least one lawsuit. Because people, as soon as they figured this out, 10 years later, that this might actually be useful, they tried to patent the voice over IP. And of course, this prevented them from doing that. It was prior art to cut that off. You'll notice that this is microprocessor based. Those larger blocks, that one there, that's a microprocessor, and those other ones are EEPROMs and others. So by this time, we'd beginning to build hardware that was microprocessor based by 1980, pretty well developed. So you could use this card in a number of ways. You could build, so these cards were distributed around the ARPANET, so they were at the major nodes. So you could sit at, let's say, in Santa Monica, and you could dial up this card. It had a phone number. Call it up, and then with the touchtone phone, you enter the person you want to talk to wherever in the country. And this card would connect to its counterpart at the location that was fairly close to the buddy that you were trying to call. It might dial Lincoln Lab or whatever. Okay. And that card would then in turn place a call, local call. So what you had on the ends is you had the Bell system's last mile free phone calls with traditional handsets. But in the middle, you had ARPANET, and it didn't matter how long that was. Those were just packets, and they zoomed across the country, and that was in the packet world. So that's one model of how this card was used. The other model is, of course, you could just use one of them, and you could interact between Bell and
Dad had his phone on. Oh,
You
no.
can interact between Bell and the ARPANET just with one of these cards, because you could sit at your workstation and initiate a call, and this little card would call the number for you. You could do it that way as well. So that proved that the technology existed to couple those two worlds together.
Question? Did you publish this and not patent it? And
It was never, none of this technology was ever patented.
was that
It was documented in ISI reports, and those reports were the documents that were used in the court cases.
and was it a conscious decision to publish and not patent, or it just wasn't on your mind? You did it, and
You know, I don't know why ISI chose not to patent stuff in the early years. In the later years, I did patent a couple things, but it was just not on anybody's mind. Everything was open. It was university research. It was, publish it and you got credit for it and, move on.
Yep.
It was just the way it was done. So we successfully connected speech, right? So that was not a problem anymore. Obviously, video would be next. What could we do with transmitting video on the ARPANET? Well, this was a real problem because the terrestrial ARPANET bandwidth was nowhere near enough to be able to send a video stream, on the ARPANET. And so I don't know whether any of you remember this or not, but that picture in the upper left is a satellite dish that was on the roof of ISI, and for the wideband satellite experiments that occurred back in like 1980 or so. And so that was established here. There were 2 or 3 dishes put up across the country to enable us to do the video transmission of video transmission and conferencing across the network. So what were the challenges, right? Why couldn't we do streaming? Well, I mentioned one of them. There was just not enough bandwidth. But the algorithms weren't there either. The algorithms that were required to encode the speech were incredibly compute intensive. And there had been demonstrations that you could actually digitize speech at that time, but it took a room full of computers to do it. And so that was one thing. The low loss compression algorithm that was computationally efficient didn't exist. And then the other side of that, of course, was we just didn't have enough processing power in those days to compute the algorithms that did exist. Well, what happened during this time is 2 or 3 things came together. One was that the discrete cosine transform was discovered by others. And it turned out that was an exceptionally good choice for encoding videos. It was low loss, it was easily to compute, it was highly parallelizable, which is what we did. So the algorithm suddenly existed. Secondly, we had a relationship with Texas Instruments that allowed us to get prototype chips. And the microprocessor industry had moved along pretty well, built several generations of microprocessor, and the special purpose processors were beginning to come along, and this was a signal processing version of it, TMS 320. It would later be used in the speak and spell, if any of you are old enough to know what that is. So we were able to get several of these prototypes, probably one of the first organizations in the country to have any of them. And Jeff Lacoste designed and built this parallel processor. It's a SIMD parallel processor with DSP chips. And its purpose was to process the discrete cosine transform. And it enabled us to then do the voice and video conferencing over the network. So we did the first conferences, between ISI and Lincoln Labs using this hardware. It's distributed both to us and to Lincoln. And the rest is history. It took them a long time, but now there's an entire streaming and conferencing industry that sort of sits on top of the ARPANET, right? It's worth trillions of dollars, and it's pervasive all over the world. But it took a long time. For example, I cite Skype being coming into existence around 2003, and that's 20 years later that it took them to figure out how to overlay that. And of course, one of the things that happened to enable that is that the bandwidth of the ARPANET was continuing to move up and up and up. And at some point, those 2 curves crossed, and they were able to drop the video into of course, now you can do it from one of these things. Right? So.
Hey Bob, was the DCT there to compress the bandwidth so you get the imagery over the internet? Is that what's going on?
Lossless compression, or fairly low loss compression.
So it's pretty dramatic compression.
Yeah, well,
Right?
like I said, the curve, the bandwidth curve was coming up. So we weren't trying to get it, we were going over a satellite link. And so we had a considerable amount of bandwidth for that demonstration. Of course, that all went away. As soon as the ARPANET backbone bandwidth with fiber and all that picked up, then there's no need for the satellite dishes. But during that particular time, the only way we were going to get conferencing done was to do it over a satellite.
You remember that satellite dish being taken out? Or,
No, I don't know when it was taken out.
or James maybe?
I remember it sat up there with our amateur radio antenna, which is how we did our packet radio experiments, which is a whole other talk. Conclusions. So I mentioned that ISI was born at this really interesting intersection. And we had, we were at war at that time. Most of you have not experienced that, but in 1970, we were in the Vietnam War and it was extremely unpopular. And the Pentagon Papers, if you've ever heard of that, were released from RAND, just a few months before I arrived there. And so the country was on edge. The security mechanisms were all, ramped up. It was sort of a high tension environment. And RAND had the congressional ceiling because it was an FFRDC, belonged to the Air Force. If they had funded the ARPANET in RAND, which I think they were set up to do, I really believe that ARPA had decided that Keith was going to do this, and they would just figure out where they were going to do it. And so they could well have done it inside of RAND, except maybe for the ceiling, maybe they would have found a way around it. So there was that going on. There was Keith and his group of experts that were ready to do it, and there was a funding agency that wanted to give them the money. All that was in play. There was a university that could say yes, right? We were very likely going to go to Santa Barbara because Santa Barbara was one of the four original nodes on the network before 1970. And so we almost went there, except that was part of the state school system and they couldn't make a decision quick enough with the border regions and all that. Too many cooks in the stew. And so we ended up at USC. So there was that. There was Keith's leadership. There were bright researchers. There was all the work that we'd already done at RAND, getting ready. We sort of hit the ground running when we came to ISI. There was the sustained program at DARPA. There was the umbrella contract that made contracting really simple at ISI. There was a steady stream of funding that funded research and the build out. I mean, all of that, if you think about it, what are the odds that that would all play out, at one time? It's pretty amazing. Again, I'll make the statement that I think we've managed to change the world. Interesting. Another shiny object. So we were just in Portugal. I was in a little tiny town, walking down the main street. And there's a bunch of little family restaurants along the way. And they have their menus of the day, either in the window or maybe a chalked sign out on the street. So I walked by one, and what does it say at the bottom? It says WhatsApp and a phone number. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you're welcome. So I have some advice. I was an electrical engineer coming into a computer science organization. And so I viewed the world a little differently than most people did at ISI. And I've always found that interesting research is at the seams of technology. I mean, some people, as soon as they fall out of the cradle, they decided that they're going to dedicate their life to some cause, cure cancer, whatever it is, and that's great, and they should do it. For me, I really enjoyed a new challenge as often as I could find one. So working along the seams, and the way you find a seam, there's some examples of them here. But let me just take one. So scalable embedded. So DARPA invested in scalable computing from 1985 till I arrived over there in the mid-90s. So they pushed the bandwidth, the capacity of those machines about 4 or 5 orders of magnitude in performance during that time. When you get such a shift in a technology base, it's very likely that you can take that advance and move it to some other area. And so in this case, I moved it to embedded computing. Military had all sorts of embedded computers, but the technology there was frozen in time. It didn't move forward. So there's a seam. You walk along that seam and you can apply the technology to it. So that's just a thought for young researchers who are thinking about things to do. Sometimes the most interesting work is along those themes. The second thing is that you would be amazed how long it takes for disruption to happen. I said 20 years. I guess I understand that maybe you guys are beginning to have your phones sort of integrated with your computers here now. Well, that's 40 years. You know, come on, guys. It's like the cobbler with the shoes, right? The cobbler is the one that doesn't have any shoes, even though he invents them. So at least 20 years. So don't, you know, if you're a young researcher, you're looking at this world, it's very difficult to predict if you're going to have any sort of disruptive technology come from what you're doing today. So it's better not to worry about that. Just go with your passion, figure out what you're good at, push the envelope on that, and don't be afraid to take the path less traveled. Thank you for listening.
Take question?
Sure.
I'll get us started with one. In the early days of ISI, did you have any interaction with other parts of USC? Did you think about it, or were you just an island doing your thing and didn't care?
So it's always been sort of a strange relationship as far as I was concerned. There were some ISIers who chose to be research professors, and that caused them to have a link to the university. And there were very few university researchers who came to ISI on occasion and did work there. But there was, you know, I think in retrospect, it was great to have a spot on Marina Del Rey, right? It attracts, you know, people to come there. It's a great spot. The other hand, it probably would have integrated into the university a lot better if it had been on campus. So I think that probably hurt the interaction. So, you know, I had more interaction with USC when I went to DARPA than I did when I was at ISI.
I think we're much more closely integrated now, but it's interesting you talked about the location, because within the last year, I had a department chair at USC tell me, well, ISI suffers because you're on Marina Del Rey, you should just move to campus. And I explained to him how many people are at ISI and how closely they were tied to Marina Del Rey or Arlington or whatever. He had no idea the scale of ISI, and that we couldn't just move, you know, 200 or 300 or 400 people to any place on campus.
That was true then too. I mean, that was at the beginning, that was one of the reasons they were looking at a remote facility.
We've had recent discussions with Rand about developing new collaborations. The current relatively new CEO of Rand is an old admirer of ISI because he was the director of IARPA. His name is Jason Matheny. Funded lots of the AI work at ISI and forecasting.
Is that Rand, New York, or
No, Rand.
Rand at Santa Monica?
Santa Monica. The general thinking is they're strong in policy. They don't have so much technical stuff. We have all the technical stuff. And we complement each other.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Maybe we should merge.
Full circle.
We don't want their
Circle of life.
Yeah.
And that issue you mentioned of being an electrical engineer coming into computer science, we still think about that today. And for example, we changed our title from research programmer to research engineer so that we were inclusive of both software engineers and hardware engineers. But often those of us who do more hardware related things look at the rest of the institute and feel outnumbered.
Yeah.
You know, the institute does everything it can to be inclusive and recognize all of our talents.
Well, I think it was naturally separated back at the beginning. I mean, the researchers that came from the software side of the group at RAND had no interaction at RAND with the hardware guys. We were doing different things entirely, and that when they moved over to a new facility, that didn't change. So there was very little interaction within ISI. The network research group, because they had a lot of hardware, then that was where the connection was made. But the rest of the folks were just there.
We talked with the networking group here.
Yeah.
What other questions?
I guess in seeing sort of the arc of things, you know, this view and what's presented today is very much, oh, solve this problem and things. And, you know, after watching things for a career, you know, like the internet, we say, oh, well, maybe we should have thought about security when we were baking this to begin with. You know, and arguably we're on the cusp of another point of inflection there with AI. Maybe we should have some regulatory things there before we let the horse out of the barn.
Yeah.
You know, given your perspective in things, you know, what's your thought on that about, you know, technology development versus thinking about what might happen to it from a societal perspective?
There's another example of that. I heard Danny and a couple of the other internet pioneers talking about whether they should have used floating point for internet addresses instead of fixed point stuff. There's all these decisions that get made along the way, right? That you know, hindsight is 20/20. So, you know, I think things like security. I mean, in those days, I mean, look, the only people on the ARPANET were researchers, right? And so they weren't about to cause any problems because it was their world. They were playing in their own world. You know, and then what happened? As soon as the internet came along, what was the first major industry on the internet? Pornography. You know, and so then, you know, suddenly then it became important to have other characteristics to the internet, like security and protection and all that kind of stuff. But at the beginning would have made no sense. I probably couldn't have even sold it. You know, why bother? You were among friends, right? There was no such thing as a malicious anything. You know, we did, you know, we've done it with, you know, when we invented FPGAs, right, and all that FPGA computing and stuff, we didn't really worry about security and all that stuff. We were building a tech base and enabling reconfiguration. And
Yeah, that's enough to do in the first place.
yeah, well, it was. It took a while to do it in the first place. That's right. Yeah, so.
We have questions from online. There are about 20 people online. It was a little higher earlier, so a few people have dropped out. But questions? I have another one I can ask, but I don't want to dominate the questions without making sure other people. Bob, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you want to say any more about the history of Arlington, since you focused on the early history of ISI here today?
Well, we can say a little bit about it. I've actually been asked to generate a paper on that. So we need to figure out how to document it and find some of the people who were here at the beginning. But so ISI Arlington existed as two groups of people prior to 1997. There was a networking group that came out of the Navy, I think, NRL maybe, something like that. That's where Allison came, brought her group. So she was one group, a group of researchers here belonged to the networking group. They were one entity, and they actually were in a different location than the group that Forrest was in. There was a support group for DARPA that worked the IT aspect of stuff, built out the enterprise room on the first floor of ARPA. We're involved with, I believe, sending a lot of equipment to a desert location in around 1970. Then the equipment kind of all disappeared. Anyway, there were a lot of interesting war stories about those days. They were separate groups, although I think at one time they're in the same building. And then in 97, I came from DARPA and had young kids. And I really liked the environment here to bring kids up, good schools and, you know, trees and squirrels kind of stuff instead of, you know, rats and whatever. So we decided to create an organization here at the East Coast and bring those two together and then add in whatever I could create, you know, from my experience at DARPA. And so we pulled those two groups together and we found one location. I guess first we were down the road, 44. Okay. And we were in one location there for a while.
About 4 years.
Okay. And then well, slowly things changed. The computing side of the organization grew, hired Steve. And so a lot of things began to grow on the computing side of it. And we did some interesting projects with the National Reconnaissance Office. And slowly the support function at DARPA kind of faded away. So, you know, the rest is kind of history.
And I hope Nancy can hear us, but thank you to Nancy for your part in that.
For putting up with me.
The way I was sort of said, you just described how we wanted to say, the way I remember you saying it is, you were ready to go back and your family said, well, you can go ahead, but we're staying. So I don't know which way it worked, but thank you for that.
I don't recall getting a vote. Didn't matter, I enjoyed it.
And it worked the opposite for me. I finished my PhD at USC where I was a DRA in Marina Del Rey, and I happened to be looking for a job. And my soon-to-be wife had moved to Virginia with her family. I had met her at USC, but she was now tied to Virginia, and it just converged just perfectly. Couldn't have been better.
Yeah, no, it worked out great. And then I recruited Brian Schott from Lannel. He was from Lannel.
He was at
Fort Meade.
CC.
It might have been for me. They were
CCT.
connected.
Contractor to Fort Meade, I
Yeah.
think it was.
So then he came on, and then we slowly grew the group.
And Brian is still, he's the CTO. I don't think he's with us anymore, but he's the CTO for a cloud computing company. I don't know how you would describe it, that spun out of ISI. So it's all still connected. Still working with Bob Grable,
Yeah,
the
okay.
CEO.
Bob's online.
Bob Grable? Oh, hello, Bob. Bob may be on mute, but thank you for joining us. I'm glad you got the link. And Mike Caney, we were talking before the seminar started, was part of one of our first projects after your original project with Slack, that you wrote the big proposal that allowed us all to be hired to come together. And we worked on a project with Mike that was not long after that, probably overlapped with Slack.
Yeah, I bought Grable. You remember? I was telling Bob Parker, I still have my PCA t-shirt. So
Oh. Any other questions online? We'll be here in the room, I think, for a few more minutes. But if those online would like to drop off, if they don't have any more questions, thank you for joining us. And
Yep,
Bob,
thank
I don't
you.
know if you saw Eagles behind you. Another
Yeah.
face from the past.
Yeah. Hi.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, for joining, and thank you again, Bob. Hi, James, thank you. And I hope you can go back and give another talk about the history of East when you've got that article put
We can
together.
figure that out, yeah.